The cold autumn rain streaked down the vast windows of the penthouse boardroom, a somber gray curtain that separated the world of ordinary life from the gilded cage of extraordinary wealth. From this dizzying height on the 80th floor of a midtown Manhattan skyscraper, the city's endless grid of yellow cabs and rushing pedestrians seemed like a distant, silent diorama, a world that held no weight inside this polished, glass-walled sanctum. Here, the only currency that mattered was power, and the only sound that carried was the quiet, confident hum of a multi-billion-dollar deal coming to a close. At the head of a massive, polished mahogany table sat Marcus Sterling, a tech billionaire, whose name was a legend in the industry. He was a man in his late 50s, his silver-flecked beard and sharp, penetrating eyes giving him the look of a modern-day king. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, he exuded an air of absolute, unshakable certainty. His latest venture, a groundbreaking AI company, was on the brink of securing a deal that would not only make him even richer but would also cement his legacy as a visionary. He believed his AI would change everything, and he was right, but he saw the world only through the lens of his own success. Across from him, perfectly still and completely composed, was Lena Williams. In her early 40s, she was a venture capitalist with a reputation that was whispered about in the same reverent tones as Sterling's. As a black woman in a world still dominated by men who looked, spoke, and thought like Marcus Sterling, she had not just broken barriers. She had built a new, stronger foundation for others to follow. She represented a formidable investment firm and was here today as the final decision-maker on a staggering $4 billion funding deal. This was her moment, a strategic move that would solidify her firm's position as an unstoppable force. The presentation from Sterling's team had been flawless, a dizzying display of future technology and financial projections that promised astronomical returns. The data was there, the vision was clear, and the promise was intoxicating. All that was left was Lena's final word, the closing handshake that would seal the fate of both companies. The room was thick with unspoken anticipation. Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, a smug smile playing on his lips. He was confident, even arrogant, in his expectation of victory. How could she say no? His technology was the future, a masterpiece of innovation. He saw his success not as a privilege, but as a right. But Lena wasn't just looking at the numbers. Her sharp eyes were also observing the man behind them. The meeting concluded, and a relieved murmur rippled through Sterling's team. He waved a dismissive hand, a gesture of a monarch granting leave to his subjects. "Good work, everyone. Now, go celebrate," he said, his eyes already fixed on Lena. He stood up, ready for the final handshake. Just then, a young intern named Maya, who had been quietly taking notes in a corner, hurried forward. She was new to this world, her face still bright with the unblemished hope of a fresh start. She extended a hand to Sterling, her smile wide and genuine. "Mr. Sterling, that was incredible. Congratulations," she said, her voice full of admiration. Sterling stopped. He looked at her outstretched hand, then at her face, a flicker of something dismissive in his eyes. A low, condescending laugh escaped him, a sound that was meant to be light but felt heavy in the silent room. "I don't shake hands with staff, only with those who matter," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner. The words were a physical blow. Maya's smile vanished instantly, her face turning crimson with humiliation. She pulled her hand back as if it had been burned, her eyes dropping to the floor. A few of the senior staff looked away, embarrassed, but none dared to challenge their boss. Sterling, completely oblivious to the pain he had inflicted, turned back to Lena, a triumphant smirk on his face. He extended his hand to her, his gaze demanding her approval, her complicity in his show of power. Lena's face, which had been so serene, now held a new, chilling stillness. A deep, quiet anger began to boil inside her, a feeling she had learned to control and hide. The image of the young intern's crushed face, the innocence wiped away in an instant, was a stark contrast to Sterling's entitled arrogance. She saw not just a rude comment, but a fundamental flaw in the man's character, a flaw that would ultimately infect and destroy any company he led. The $4 billion deal, the biggest of her career, now seemed insignificant in the face of this injustice. She looked at his hand, then back into his expectant eyes. She did not take it. She stood up slowly, deliberately, a queen rising from her throne. The silence in the room returned, this time heavier and more pregnant with meaning. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice as cool and sharp as the rain outside. This deal requires a bit more review. My team will be in touch. With that, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Maya, a silent message of solidarity. Then, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving the powerful billionaire standing there, his hands still outstretched, his smug smile replaced by a look of bewildered shock. The suspense was not in what would happen, but in the certainty that something had already been broken, something far more valuable than a mere business deal. The silence in the opulent boardroom was a heavy, suffocating thing, but it was nothing compared to the quiet storm raging inside Lena Williams. She walked away from Marcus Sterling, his outstretched hand now a monument to his shattered pride, and felt the weight of her refusal more than the potential for $1 billion she had just left hanging in the balance. Each step she took was deliberate, a quiet declaration that some things, even in the ruthless world of high finance, were not for sale. The click of her heels on the marble floor was the only sound, a sharp punctuation to the unwritten sentence she had just delivered. Outside the boardroom, the rain was still coming down, a steady drumming against the glass, and it seemed to wash away the last vestiges of Sterling's illusion of control. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. The image of Maya's crushed face, the young intern whose simple act of kindness was met with such cruel arrogance, was burned into her mind. It was a face that reminded Lena of herself many years ago, full of hope and eager to prove her worth, only to be met with the cold realities of a world that didn't always see her value. The memory was not just a passing thought. It was a foundational brick of her entire professional philosophy. She had built her career on the belief that true value was found not just in technology or profit margins, but in the people who created them. To invest in Sterling's company, a company led by a man who so carelessly dismissed a member of his own team, would have been a betrayal of everything she stood for. It would have been an investment in a future she did not believe in, a future built on disrespect and arrogance. The thought was a bitter taste in her mouth. She reached the elevator, her team waiting for her. Her assistant, Marcus, looked at her with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Everything all right, Lena? You seemed, well, you left a bit suddenly." Lena stepped into the elevator, the doors closing with a soft hiss, and the feeling of being trapped in a silent box with her own thoughts was almost unbearable. The elevator descended, and the world of the ordinary began to rush back into view. The deal was a career-defining moment, a landmark achievement that would put her firm on a level they had only dreamed of. But what good was a landmark if the foundation was rotten? What good was a victory if it meant sacrificing your soul to win? These questions swirled in her mind, a dizzying cascade of doubt and certainty. The silence in the elevator was an invitation for her to question her decision, to go back, to rationalize Sterling's behavior as just business as usual. But she couldn't. The face of the intern, Maya, was too clear. She could still see the flicker of hope in her eyes before it was snuffed out. She could still feel the weight of the moment, the chilling truth of Sterling's arrogance. When the elevator doors opened into the sleek, modern lobby, her driver was waiting. The rain was now a gentle drizzle, and the city lights twinkled like 1,000 tiny promises. Lena stepped out, the cool air hitting her face, a welcome change from the stifling atmosphere of the boardroom. She got into the back seat of her car, and as the engine started, she took a deep breath. She looked at Marcus, who was still waiting for an answer. "Marcus," she said, her voice calm and firm, "pull up the file on Sterling's company. We need to put the deal on hold." Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief. "On hold, Lena? This is a $4 billion deal. This is what we've been working on for 6 months." The weight of his words was undeniable. The sheer scale of the investment was something they had all dreamed of. It was the kind of deal that made careers, that changed lives. But Lena knew that sometimes the biggest decisions weren't about the numbers. "I know," she said, her voice softer now, but no less resolute. "And I also know that a company's true value isn't just in its technology, but in its people. Sterling showed us today that he doesn't value his people. He sees them as tools, not as partners. An investment in his company would be an investment in that kind of thinking, and I can't do that. It's not who we are." Marcus looked at her, and for a moment, the protest was still on his lips. But then, he saw the unwavering conviction in her eyes, the quiet strength that had made her so successful. He saw that this was not a rash decision, but a deeply held belief. He nodded slowly, a new understanding dawning on his face. "Okay, Lena. On hold it is." The words were a quiet finality, the echo of her own decision. As the car pulled away from the skyscraper, Lena looked out the window, watching the city lights. blur into streaks of color. She knew she had made the right choice, but she also knew that the fallout from this decision would be immense. Sterling would not take this lightly. The financial world would be in an uproar. Her own career, which she had worked so hard to build, might be at risk. But as she thought about the young intern's face, the hope in her eyes, she felt a sense of peace. She had chosen to invest in a different kind of future, one where everyone mattered. And that, she knew, was an investment worth far more than $4 billion. The suspense was no longer about what she would do, but about the consequences of what she had already done, and the story of the quiet refusal had just begun. The car moved silently through the wet city streets, a cocoon of calm in the midst of a storm only Lena Williams could feel. She stared out the window, watching the rain-slicked pavement and the blurred lights of the passing buildings. But she saw none of it. Her mind was miles away, pulled into a memory so vivid it felt like she was living it all over again. The young intern's face, a mirror of her own youthful hope, had been the trigger. But the decision she had just made was years in the making. It was a choice, born from the quiet wisdom of a woman who had taught her everything, a mentor named Patricia. Lena had been a junior associate back then, full of ambition but also a bit naive to the ruthless nature of the business world. She had just closed her first major deal, a small but significant victory that felt monumental to her. She had been bragging about it in Patricia's office, caught up in the glow of her success. Patricia, a woman of grace and steel, had listened patiently, a small smile on her face. When Lena finally finished, Patricia had simply said, "True power, Lena, isn't about how many people you can command. It's about how many you can respect. An empire built on disrespect is a house of cards." The words had hit Lena not as a criticism, but as a profound truth. Patricia had explained to her that the real strength of a company wasn't in its big names or its impressive technology, but in the collective effort of every person. From the janitor who kept the building clean to the intern who brought coffee, every single person was a part of the foundation. If you dismissed any one of them, you were creating a weakness, a crack that would eventually run through the entire structure and cause it to collapse. Lena had carried that lesson with her every day since. It was a core principle, a non-negotiable part of her identity. It was why she took the time to know the names of the security guards and the cleaning staff at her office. It was why she made sure to thank her own team for their hard work, not just with words but with genuine appreciation. She understood that respect was not a luxury. It was the most important building material of all. And in that boardroom today, she had seen Marcus Sterling tear down that foundation with a single, arrogant sentence. He had looked at a young, eager person and declared them not to matter. A statement that wasn't just cruel, but deeply short-sighted. It was an investment in a future where only the elite mattered. A future that was, in her mentor's words, a house of cards waiting to fall. The memory gave her clarity and a fierce sense of resolve. The doubt that had been nagging at the edges of her mind vanished, replaced by an unshakable conviction. She knew now, with absolute certainty, that her decision was not just right, it was necessary. The potential for $1 billion deal was a temptation, a dazzling prize, but it was also a test, and she had passed it. Back in the car, Marcus was still looking at her, waiting. He saw a change in her, a shift from quiet contemplation to resolute action. "We're not just putting it on hold," Lena said, her voice now completely devoid of hesitation. "Pulled the offer, officially." Now Marcus's eyes widened again, but this time there was no argument. Only a dawning realization that the biggest deal of their careers was officially over. He began to type on his laptop, a flurry of quick keystrokes. The email was drafted in minutes, short and to the point. Subject: withdrawal of funding offer. The body was even more concise, stating that, due to a change in strategic outlook, the Williams Group was officially withdrawing its offer to Sterling Industries. It was a professional, cold, and final message. A digital guillotine for a deal that had been all but done. With a single click of a button, Marcus sent the email. A feeling of finality settled over them both. Lena watched as her phone, which had been silent for the past hour, began to buzz with notifications. News of the withdrawal would not stay quiet for long. She imagined the chaos that would soon erupt in Sterling's office, the panic that would spread among his investors, the media frenzy that was about to begin. She had pulled the plug on his legacy, not out of spite, but out of principle. She had chosen to uphold a moral standard, a belief in the inherent value of every person, over the promise of immense wealth. The suspension of the past hour, the quiet tension, had been a prelude to this moment. The real storm was about to begin, and she was ready for it. The story had moved from the silent refusal of a handshake to the public and devastating withdrawal of a multi-billion-dollar investment, and the consequences for Marcus Sterling were now inevitable. The finality of the email, a digital guillotine for a multi-billion-dollar deal, landed in Marcus Sterling's inbox with the quiet force of a seismic shock. He was not in his office, but at a celebratory lunch with his most trusted senior executives, toasting their supposed success. The mood was one of smug victory. He was on top of the world, his ego inflated by the knowledge that his new AI company was about to become a financial juggernaut. He had his phone on the table, a habit born of his constant need to be in control, and it buzzed with a notification he initially dismissed as an unimportant detail. But the panicked look on his CFO's face, as he excused himself to take a call, told Sterling that something was wrong. A moment later, the CFO returned, pale and shaking. "Sir," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "the Williams Group, they've pulled the funding. All $4 billion. The words hit Sterling with a physical force. The smug smile on his face froze, then shattered. "What? That's impossible," he roared, grabbing his phone. "We had a deal. I was just with her." He found the email and read the cold, concise message, his disbelief quickly turning into a furious rage. He immediately tried to call Lena, but her number went straight to voicemail. He tried again and again, each ring a hammer blow against his carefully constructed world. His arrogance, which had been his greatest strength, was now his greatest weakness, blinding him to the obvious reason for her action. He couldn't comprehend that his dismissive comment to a young intern could have had such a devastating effect. He saw it as a minor detail, a casual joke, a moment of harmless fun. In his mind, it was Lena who was being irrational, petty, and unprofessional. He had no idea he had just committed the corporate equivalent of a public suicide. The chaos that ensued was a beautiful, terrible ballet of a man losing control. He stormed out of the restaurant, leaving his stunned executives to stare at their untouched champagne glasses. The news, like a wildfire, began to spread. Within minutes, the stock market reacted with brutal efficiency. Sterling's company stock, which had been climbing steadily all day, plummeted. The drop was not a gentle slope, but a sheer cliff, a dizzying freefall that erased hundreds of millions of dollars in value. Other investors, seeing the sudden and inexplicable withdrawal of such a massive deal, panicked. They began to sell their shares, a cascade of fear that only accelerated the collapse. The media, always hungry for a story of a titan's fall, was all over it. Headlines began to appear on every major financial news site. Sterling's star falls. Mystery backing pullout. Is Sterling's AI company in trouble? The speculation was rampant, the rumors flying wild. Was the technology a fraud? Was there a problem with the company's financials? Was Sterling himself under investigation? The narrative was no longer about his groundbreaking AI. It was about his sudden and dramatic downfall. He was in his office, alone, watching the numbers on his computer screen bleed red. The room, which had been a fortress of his power just a few hours ago, now felt like a prison. The silence was not peaceful, but terrifying. He tried to call Lena again, but her phone was off. He called his lawyers, his public relations team, everyone he knew who could help him. But there was no explaining this. There was no spinning the story of a $4 billion deal disappearing in a puff of smoke. He had prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his world, to bend it to his will. But now, his world was in freefall, and he was helpless to stop it. He, a man who had built an empire, was now just a terrified man, watching as it crumbled around him. The emotional toll was immense. The arrogant smile was gone, replaced by a look of fear and confusion. He felt the weight of his legacy, not as a monument to his greatness, but as a ticking time bomb. The people who had once respected him were now questioning him. The power he had taken for granted was slipping through his fingers. He had always believed that money was the ultimate arbiter of value, but today, he had learned a far more important lesson: that respect, or the lack thereof, could be even more expensive. The suspense was no longer about what he would do, but about what he would be forced to face. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across his now empty office, he finally sent a message, not to his lawyers or his investors, but a desperate plea for a meeting with Lena. The man who had dismissed a handshake now desperately needed one. The quiet cafe was a world away from the gleaming boardroom where it had all started. Rain was no longer falling, and the afternoon sun cast a soft, forgiving light through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. This was a neutral ground, A place of simple, everyday interactions. A stark contrast to the high-stakes, high-pressure world Marcus Sterling had inhabited just a week ago. He sat alone at a small table, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in front of him. His usual impeccable suit now looking tired and rumpled. The man who had once exuded absolute power now looked small, bewildered, and genuinely scared. Across from him sat Lena Williams, her presence a quiet force of nature. She arrived on time, alone, her face a serene mask of professionalism. She did not offer a handshake. She simply sat down, her gaze steady and direct. "Thank you for meeting me, Lena," Sterling began, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar to his own ears. I don't understand what happened. We had a deal, a perfect deal, and you took it all away." He gestured with his hands, a helpless, desperate movement. He was still trying to find a logical, financial reason for her actions. "You pulled a $4 billion deal over a handshake." The disbelief in his voice was thick, a final, desperate clinging to his old way of thinking. Lena took a slow sip of her tea, the warmth a welcome contrast to the coldness of his words. "It was never about the handshake, Marcus," she said, her voice soft but firm, a stark contrast to his bluster. "The handshake was a symbol. It was a glimpse into the soul of your company, a window into how you truly value the people who work for you. You looked at a young, bright woman, a member of your own staff, and declared her to be insignificant. You told her she didn't matter. What kind of leader does that?" Sterling opened his mouth to protest, to dismiss it as a joke, to rationalize his behavior, but the words died in his throat. He saw the genuine hurt in Lena's eyes, a reflection of the same hurt he had inflicted. For the first time, he was forced to see himself not as a titan of industry, but as a man who had casually crushed another person's spirit. He thought back to that moment in the boardroom, the young intern's eager face and her genuine smile, and then the sudden, sickening collapse of her hope. The memory now felt like a physical pain in his chest, a direct result of his own careless cruelty. "That handshake," Lena continued, leaning forward slightly, her voice a quiet challenge, "was a glimpse into the future you were building. A future where respect is a privilege, not a right. A future where people are disposable, and only power matters. I cannot, and will not, invest in that kind of future. The $4 billion was an investment in a vision, and your actions told me you don't share that vision. You don't believe that everyone matters. You don't believe in the people who hold up the foundation of your empire." The words hung in the air between them, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Sterling looked down at his cold coffee, his mind replaying every detail of the last week. The plummeting stock price, the worried phone calls, the headlines, the sudden, terrifying silence of his power crumbling. He had blamed the market, his competitors, and especially Lena. But now, sitting here in this quiet cafe, he understood. He had brought this upon himself. The cost of his arrogance was not just financial. It was the loss of his reputation, the respect of his peers, and, most importantly, the understanding that he was a man who had built an empire on a flawed, empty principle. He felt a profound sense of shame, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a young man first starting out, a feeling that was more painful than any monetary loss. He looked up at Lena, his eyes no longer full of anger, but of a desperate, humbling honesty. "I was wrong," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "I'm sorry, I never saw it that way." The apology was not a plea for her to return the money, but a genuine acknowledgement of his mistake. Lena simply nodded. The gesture was not one of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement. She had accomplished what she came to do. She had forced him to look in the mirror. She stood up, leaving a small amount of cash for her tea on the table. "I hope you learn a very important lesson from this, Marcus," she said, her voice now softer, but still firm. "An empire is only as strong as the people who build it." She turned and walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his ruined empire. The story ends, not with a grand resolution, but with a beginning. Sterling sat in the quiet cafe, a man who had everything and had lost so much more. He reached for his phone, not to call his lawyers, but to send a message to his assistant. He wanted to know the name of the intern. He wanted to start rebuilding, not his fortune, but himself. And this time, he would do it differently, with a new understanding that some things, like respect, were priceless.